He said he did it. Those 4 simple words should have been the end of the story, a confession, a neat conclusion to a brutal and baffling crime that had terrified a small, tight-knit community. When a suspect walks into a police station and lays out the details of a murder, detectives usually breathe a sigh of relief. The case is closed. The paperwork can be filed. The family can find some semblance of peace. The town can feel safe once more. But this time something was different. Something felt profoundly, unsettlingly wrong. The words hung in the air of that sterile interrogation room, heavy with a certainty that seemed almost too perfect, too practiced. It was the answer everyone was desperate to hear. But was it the truth? For the investigators who had spent countless sleepless nights chasing shadows and dead-end leads, the confession was a breakthrough. It was a sudden blinding light in a tunnel that had seemed endlessly dark. The man who sat before them, looking tired and defeated, knew details only the killer could know. He described the scene with an eerie calm, his voice steady as he recounted the final terrifying moments of the victim's life. He didn't waver. He didn't ask for a lawyer, he simply wanted to admit what he had done, to unburden his soul. The relief in the precinct was palpable. A case that had haunted their every waking moment was finally, mercifully, over. Or so they thought. The town celebrated the arrest, believing the monster was finally off their streets. But in the quiet corners of the investigation, a seed of doubt began to sprout. It was a small thing, at first. A piece of the story that didn't quite lock into place. A timeline that felt just a little too tight. A detail that contradicted a minor piece of physical evidence found at the scene. These were the kinds of inconsistencies that could often be explained away, chalked up to the fog of memory or the stress of a confession. Yet for one detective, these tiny fractures in the suspect's perfect story were impossible to ignore. They nagged at him, whispering that the easy answer might not be the right one, that while a man was confessing, the real killer could still be out there, watching, waiting, and enjoying their freedom. The community, hungry for justice, had already passed its judgment. The local news ran headlines declaring the case solved. The victim's family, shattered by their loss, clung to the confession as the only solid thing in a world that had been turned upside down. They needed someone to blame, someone to hold responsible for the gaping hole that had been torn in their lives. The man in custody fit the part. He had admitted his guilt after all. What more proof did anyone need? Before the confession, it was only fear. A thick, suffocating blanket of it had settled over the town of Oakhaven. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where kids played in the streets until the sun went down, and where neighbors knew each other by name. But that all changed on a cold October morning when the body was found. The murder was brutal, senseless, and it happened in a place that had always felt immune to such violence. Suddenly, familiar streets felt menacing. Every rustle of leaves in the wind sounded like footsteps. Every stranger's glance felt like a threat. The illusion of safety had been shattered. And in its place grew a potent, chilling paranoia that infected everyone. The police were under immense pressure. The mayor promised swift justice, and the police chief held daily press conferences. But behind the scenes, frustration was mounting. The crime scene had offered few clues. There were no witnesses, no clear motive, and no obvious suspects. Mom, this is the unthinkable question that began to surface. For the public, the case was closed, but for one skeptical detective, it was becoming more tangled. The suspect's story began to fray under scrutiny. He would misremember key details he had previously stated with confidence. When shown photos of the scene, he seemed confused. His confession looked rehearsed. A script. Asked to go off script, he faltered. Police are trained to look for deception, but they are also trained to trust. A confession, a false confession, is a detective's worst nightmare. It can send an investigation spiraling the wrong way. It can waste precious time, and it can let the real perpetrator escape justice. It raises a chilling prospect. An innocent person punished for a crime they didn't commit. The air in the interrogation room was stale, thick with the scent of cheap coffee, desperation. And in the center of that box sat Daniel Carter. He wasn't a monster, he wasn't a hardened criminal. For hours, Detective Miller, Detective Russo had been questioning him, their voices a low, rhythmic drone circling the same questions again and again. But then something shifted. After hours of quiet denials, mumbled confusion, Daniel's posture changed.
The words came out in a quiet rush, barely more than a whisper. "I did it."
The detectives froze. They exchanged a quick, disbelieving glance. "Miller, Daniel, you need to tell us exactly what you mean."
Daniel didn't flinch. He just nodded slowly, a single tear tracing a path through the exhaustion on his face. "I killed her. I killed Sarah Jenkins."
The atmosphere in the room transformed instantly. Daniel began to speak, his voice flat, almost robotic, as if he were recalling a movie he had seen long ago. He described following Sarah home. He detailed the argument that supposedly erupted on her doorstep. He recounted the final, brutal act with a chilling detachment. It was almost too easy, but in that moment relief washed over them, so powerful and so complete that it drowned out the tiny, nagging voice of doubt. Back in the sterile environment of the forensics lab, the evidence was telling, well, a different story. The first crack, DNA results. Hairs clutched in Sarah Jenkins' hand, sign of a struggle, did not match Daniel Carter. Then came the second crack. Gas station security camera near the bridge was pulled. They found Daniel's car, but the timestamp was off. His confession placed him at the bridge shortly after 11. The footage showed him at 10:15, nearly an hour before the coroner's estimated time of death. Russo laid the DNA report and the time-stamped photo on Miller's desk. "This isn't right, Dave," he said. "His story doesn't line up with the facts." After another sleepless night, Miller made his decision. He recommended they do the unthinkable, reopen the investigation. The primary objective was simple: find the man whose DNA was on the victim. The first step was to run the DNA profile through Codish. The report came back, no match. Without a name, they resorted to old-fashioned police work. They collected voluntary DNA from her male co-workers, ex-boyfriends, and neighbors. They decided to revisit the source, the crime scene. A window in the back of the house had faint pry marks near the lock that had been overlooked. One elderly woman, who had been dismissed as confused during the first canvass, mentioned a blue work van she didn't recognize. A different neighbor remembers seeing a blue van parked near a small wooded park at the end of Sarah Street. He remembered one crucial detail. On the dashboard of the van, he saw a small distinctive air freshener shaped like a pine tree, bright orange. The clerk remembered a guy, a construction worker, always came in late, bought the same three things: a coffee, a lottery ticket, and an orange air freshener. At Apex, the owner recognized him immediately, Otto. That sounds like Mark Renshaw, he said. He was fired about a month ago. Unlike Daniel Carter, Renshaw had a record. He had multiple arrests for assault, burglary, and a restraining order filed by a former girlfriend. After 2 days, they got their chance. He tossed an empty cup into a public trash can. Russo moved in and retrieved the discarded cup. Finally, the call came. The saliva DNA on the straw was a perfect match to the unknown DNA from the hair. It was him. Mark Renshaw was the killer. The raid on Mark Renshaw's apartment was swift and decisive. He was apprehended without a fight. In a toolbox in the back of his blue van, they found a small collection of items wrapped in an oily rag. Inside was a wallet. It was Sarah Jenkins' wallet, tucked away in a closet. They found a pair of work boots. The tread pattern was a perfect match to a partial shoe print found beneath Sarah Jenkins' kitchen window. The arrest of Mark Renshaw led to the immediate exoneration of Daniel Carter. He walked out of the county jail a free man, but he was not the same person. He pleaded guilty to avoid trial and the death penalty. He was sentenced to life without parole. The case of Daniel Carter became a cautionary tale, studied in law schools and police academies. It highlighted the profound psychological pressures of the interrogation room. It serves as a stark reminder that a confession, long considered the gold standard of evidence, can sometimes be the most misleading clue of all. It reveals that the line between steadfast denial and compliant surrender is thinner and more fragile than any of us would like to admit. The heroes of this story were not the ones who found the first easy answer. They were the ones who had the courage to admit they were wrong. The case of the Oak Haven murder forces us to look inward and ask ourselves a difficult question. If you were in that room, exhausted and alone, with authority figures insisting on your guilt, could you be sure? Would you ever confess to something you didn't do? Tell us why or why not in the comments below.